Okay, so it's a pleasure and an honor to have Iain McGilchrist on as my third guest, and I expect it will be a deep and diverse conversation. So I've been climbing Mount McGilchrist. I've been calling the two volumes. I mean, just for the people who don't know it, this is Mount McGilchrist, and I mean, to give some idea of the scope of it, it's 200 pages of references, right? Almost 200 pages of references. The scholarship is astounding, really. So I've been digging into this for a couple of months now, actually. We'll be largely focusing on this book today. I mean, many people have said that it's one of the great books of our age. I think that's absolutely true. So Iain is very well known now on YouTube. I mean, sort of many people's best loved guest on various podcasts. Iain has his own channel, McGilchrist, which is, I think, run by Mary Atwood, who I discovered is also a very interesting and accomplished scholar as well. I did a little bit of just background research out of interest, and she's very interesting work.
Yes, she's
so Iain's an
historian.
yeah. Accomplished in several different fields: psychiatry, neuroscience, philosophy, literary studies. Was a former fellow of All Souls, and I think you had several of those, including the Senior Research Fellowship, which is kind of like an academic's heaven, that Senior Research Fellowship.
I didn't. No, I never had the Senior Research Fellowship at All Souls. I had a prize fellowship at All Souls.
Are you a prize fellowship? Well,
when
the place itself...
21 till 28 was my first age. That was my first fellowship, yeah.
Yeah, that's a beautiful place, anyway.
It is. In retrospect, it was a phenomenal gift. Well, I knew it was a gift at the time, and I thought I might have wasted it, but actually I've realized that ideas need time to incubate, and a lot was going on, actually, at the time. So, there we are.
Yeah, beautiful buildings. I remember, I've only been once, but there was a very nice painting of Isaiah Berlin in the room I was in. Yeah.
Yes.
So, I mean, you've had experience across the fields, basically, right? Across the humanities and the sciences, and best known, obviously, for the hemisphere hypothesis. And I must say, when Master and His Emissary first came out, I had a knee-jerk reaction. I was basically influenced by the groupthink being in science, and read a bit of it, and people were kind of saying, they got caught up on the hemispheres thing, but of course, the key point is the attention systems, right? The modes of attention that the hemispheres are underwriting. So in the left hemisphere, you have a virtual map of the world. In the right hand, you have this imponderable bloom. It's a favorite word of mine from E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops. And then the left hand is indirect and relates not to the being that it's about, but to your own representation, right? And this is the source of the problems. Whereas the right hand is supposed to be more directly related to otherness in general, really. And it's more of an I-thou relation than an I-it relation, which kind of transforms how you engage with the world. I mean, it helps you. I mean, in one, you are engaging with the world. In the other, you're engaging basically with a simulacrum of the world, as I understand it.
Dean, can I just interject that just for the clarity of meaning for the listener, that when you say right hand, what you mean is the right hemisphere, which actually controls the left hand.
That's a good point.
So actually, it's if possible, just use the words right and left for the two hemispheres, because in the body they control the opposite side. Yeah,
good point. Okay, well, so we'll be going into some of these ideas. There's way too many themes to go through the book, so I'll pick off a few themes, just a few fruits that sort of I think we both have in common, topics that we both have in common. So anyway, Iain, welcome for taking the time out. I know you're hugely busy at the moment, and I'm extremely grateful to have you on as my third guest.
I'm delighted and honoured, and I should be your third guest, so thank you.
Since you've done so many of these podcasts now, you've probably been able to compress and refine what the book is about and what it means to you. I mean, what's your current sort of best nutshell definition of what the aim was in the book, what you hope it's doing, and how you see the book?
When you say the book, do you mean the matter with things?
Yeah.
Yes. It grew out of a project that I abandoned, which was to write a shorter version of The Master and His Emissary, and I could see nothing in that for me, because it would just mean saying crudely and roughly what I had taken pains to say more carefully at length. So there was no point in that. Instead, I wanted to examine the question which I think surely is at the centre of philosophy, if there is any point in doing philosophy, which is what can we take to be true, at least not in some absolute sense that there is a truth out there that is graspable, but that if there is no sense of things being truer or less true, then there's no point in inquiry of any kind. It produces silence, effectively. So I wanted to start from this paradox that the two hemispheres produce for us two phenomenological worlds. They have quite different qualities, and so it's not what the two hemispheres do, but the way in which they do it, as you quite rightly say, the kind of attention that's paid to the world. And that turns out to be, unsurprisingly to philosophers, fairly crucial distinction, because if you attend to something in one way, you will find one thing, and attend in another, you'll find another. And the difference is between a very targeted attention to a detail, which is decontextualized, abstract, disembodied, isolated, and dead, and a vision of things that are essentially always changing, always interconnected, where the implicit matters at least as much, if not a good deal more, than the explicit, where things are embedded and embodied in the world and so forth, and that is an animate picture. So if there are these two visions, which should we give more credence to? And I'd hinted at the answer to this in the earlier book, The Master and His Emissary, but I wanted to lay out the quite extensive neurological, neuropsychological literature on hemisphere differences, and that's why there are 6,000 papers or books that are referred to in the bibliography, as you say. And to sum up that book, there were three stages to it. There's part one, which is really neuropsych. And in that, what I'm aiming to show conclusively is that, quite contrary to the bad old pop psych understanding of hemisphere differences, the left hemisphere is not reliable. In fact, it is on its own prone to delusions. It is the right hemisphere that is a much better guide to reality. So that is the effect of part one, is to show that there is a difference. And people might well say, but I don't care, honestly, where it comes from in my brain, as long as, I have some way of judging the phenomena, But what I think they're missing is that you can see very clearly the hallmark, the impression of the left hemisphere on whatever it takes, and equally a different one for the right hemisphere. And if that's the case, you know which one is more likely to be nearer to the truth. It doesn't prove anything, but it gives you a very good guide. And in the past, in philosophy, one has had to say, well, this school of thought reached this conclusion, this school of thought thought in a different way and came to this conclusion, shrug of the shoulders, whichever one you like. But I don't think that is any longer a necessary stopping place. In all sense of my, modesty as a philosopher, I think I've added something. In other words, I think you can now say, well, this looks very right hemisphere driven, and it includes all the hallmarks that one would expect. This other one looks very left hemisphere driven, and probably is not going to be nearer to the truth. That's part one. Part two is easy to express very quickly. I look at four main routes to truth once you've gone through the phase of receiving information about the environment. I've shown in part one that the right hemisphere is much better at that, both the receiving of it, the understanding of it, the interpretation of it, and so on. So what are those four paths? They're basically science, reason, intuition, and imagination. And I have 3 chapters on each of science, reason, and intuition, and finally wrap them together with imagination. And what I'm showing in those chapters is that each of these has its particular strengths, but each of them have its particular limitations. And so it's no good just saying, well, we're only going to use 1 or 2 of these things. You really have to bring them all together if you really want to understand what's going on, which has implications for whatever AI can do, as much of what I have to say does. And part 3 is really saying, okay, so taking together what we know about the relative reliability of the right hemisphere compared with the left, and we know that we need to follow evidence from science, reason, and intuition, and use our imagination as scientists and mathematicians famously do when they make their big discoveries. What does the cosmos look like? And so I have chapters on the coincidence of opposites, the one and the many, which I think is a very important topic in philosophy, particularly, of course, well known in the East, but nonetheless very important for us too. Time, flow, space, matter, consciousness, values, purpose, and the sense of the sacred. None of those, I think, can be bypassed if one wants to get some idea of the cosmos in which we live. And what I wanted to suggest was that the way in which we think in the West now, which is very reductive, very prone to simple materialism, that matter is just lumpen matter, it doesn't have anything to do with consciousness, and quite possibly consciousness doesn't exist. A very difficult position to argue for with any kind of coherence, but never mind, people do. In fact, we belong to a cosmos in which we play a crucial role, and that our understanding of things is critical to the coming about of whatever does come about. And I just want to I'll finish here, but I just want to say I like to make clear that I'm not arguing at all along with certain kinds of thinker who suggest that effectively there is no reality, we simply make it all up. I'm not saying we make it all up. I believe there is something that exists that is not made up by us. But I also think that we can't just view it as naively a thing or a group of things out there that we can approach along a regular path and find one day, because the questions we ask, the way in which we approach it, the nature of our attention ultimately changes what it is that we find. So we can't take ourselves out of the picture.
Yeah, very good. Well, we'll get to some of those, and the mumbo idea, as you call it, miraculously made up by us. So, I mean, I was going to go down a different route, but on the idea of being against scientific reductionism, I mean, one way that you might view this project, a naive person looking at the idea of its brain hemispheres might view that as, well, the brain is matter. You're reducing our pictures of reality to a material system, essentially. How do you get around that?
Well, I think would become apparent to any reader that the intention is not reductive. I'm not suggesting that the brain is us, or that the brain is consciousness. I'm suggesting that there is obviously some connection between consciousness and the brain, that can't be disputed, but quite what that connection is up for grabs. And in brief, I think it can neither emit consciousness, and nobody has ever produced a remotely convincing argument for how something that has nothing to do with consciousness, is just lumpen matter, can suddenly, by a miracle at some point, produce consciousness, or it can transmit consciousness, much as a radio set would do, or it permeates consciousness, which is my favourite view. And an analogy might be that if I want to look at the flow of water when rain falls on the landscape, it will eventually go into certain streams, and we can't ignore that fact, and those streams help shape the water, but they aren't themselves the water. They don't make the water. In fact, all they do is permit the water to go certain places and prevent it from going other places. And so I see the brain as having that kind of a role in relation to consciousness.
But you're largely largely agnostic on what it is that might be coming in and being permitted, because obviously you don't want to face something like a Cartesian interaction problem, right? So you have to say there is something that we don't quite know, which is this consciousness, and it clearly is affected by the brain, but you don't want to say and sort of beyond that. Is that the idea?
Well, I think there is consciousness, and we do know it in the most important sense, in that it is in fact one thing that we certainly know, if you like, but we don't know what its character is, as though we could stand outside of it and take a look at it and compare it with something else. There is nothing else to compare it with, and when one's describing something, one is dependent on the idea of making a likeness with something else, and there just isn't anything. So I think one is bound to remain somewhat agnostic about consciousness, but it doesn't mean one can't say things about it. And I also think, and this is where I believe we may part company, I believe that the most rational position is that consciousness is there, as it were, from the outset, that the cosmos contains consciousness, and that there is no dichotomy, there is no Cartesian divide between matter and consciousness. In fact, jumping ahead a great deal, I argue that matter is a way in which consciousness can manifest.
Oh, that's exactly my view as well. So that's so I don't.
Oh, is it?
But,
oh,
yes.
Fabulous!
We'll maybe get to that later. On the business of truth that you started with when you were describing the book. So you mentioned that each hemisphere essentially has its own way of approaching the truth, of the idea that it has of how to get to truth. And you mentioned that the left uses apprehension. It tries to grasp at things, whereas the right comprehends things. So, I mean, this takes us nicely into something I wanted to get into, which is the split that happened. I mean, what we're suffering from at the moment is this split in disciplines, especially science and humanities and science and philosophy, which are essentially sort of supervene on top of this hemisphere split, right? And I wonder if you've looked at a potential early cause of that, or at least something that went in parallel, which is within science, there was the split between experimenters and theorists, right? There never used to be the same split there either. Just as scientists used to be natural philosophers, they used to just be scientists, exactly. Experimenters, they did the whole lot. So they would have blended apprehension and comprehension. So there was a second split. I mean, I think it was probably earlier, that happened before the other split. So it already separated into one where you have the scientists who deal with a virtual representation, and they're no longer getting involved in the world. Whereas the great discoveries that we had in electromagnetism, for example, with Ørsted, were founded in nature philosophy, right? The idea of a unity of nature, it was founded on those principles. Faraday, when he was doing his science, he didn't use mathematics or anything. He was handling the objects and curving solenoids, and they were like living equations, basically.
Yes.
But then this suddenly ends a little bit after Faraday. I mean, Maxwell probably was one of the causes of making it very mathematical. Forget about the physical systems. So I wonder if you've thought about the potential impact of this earlier separation as well, and what you make of that.
Yes, I think it's important to imagine theory and experiment, which is really just a kind of experience, as going backwards and forwards. I think it's a bit like something that Whitehead said, that the philosopher takes off in a plane and surveys, and then comes back down and it goes back to real ground and then takes off again. So there should always be a reciprocal enhancement going on. And I agree with Whitehead that the divorce between science and what he called metaphysics is one of the biggest catastrophes of our age and should never have happened. And I'm trying to help bring them together. And of course, in the current world, scientists say, well, I love the science in your work, but the philosophy, I mean, why do you bring that into it? And the philosophers say, well, I find the philosophy very interesting, but I don't know about the science. But I'm trying to bring these things together, and to an extent, that's a dialogue that's ongoing and very important. But I think what happened was that we got carried away by our capacity to create neat systems, that we jumped to conclusions. Now, according to what people used to say about the hemispheres, you'd think the right hemisphere was the quick and dirty one that jumped to conclusions. But it most obviously and demonstrably is not. It is the left hemisphere that rushes in and makes a quick judgment. And the right hemisphere is, as Ramachandran, great neuroscientist, said, the devil's advocate, the one that says, hang on a moment, it might not be like that. Now, good science needs to be moving again between positions of skepticism and being able to say, well, with some reticence, we can put forward this as a likely position. And I think unless there is this coming and going between these dipoles, as I call them, that both of which are necessary and both of which must be held, then we run the risk of going off into a world of fantasy. And I think that in a way what happened in the scientific revolution at the end of the 17th century was that we made great strides in looking at things from a certain point of view, which enabled us to understand mechanisms. But unfortunately, it didn't enable us to see anything beyond mechanisms. And of course, if you were only looking for mechanisms, you only believe in mechanisms, all you will find is mechanisms. But if you believe in an organism that is much more complex, not just complicated, but of course complex, then you'd see something else. Does that address at all what you're asking or not? I feel I haven't really answered your question.
Well, I mean, the point I was making was just that there was already division that had happened that I think is also extremely significant for the mess we're in, because the science that we have now is so heavily in the realm of fantasy, I would think, so heavily based in the model rather than in the reality, that it's kind of running the world, right? We're running the world on the virtual models by scientists who are not getting their hands dirty in the world. There's a separation that's happened. I mean, it's at its limits now in science with things like string. You have string theory on the one end of the spectrum, the theoretical end of the spectrum, and then you have gargantuan experiments like the LHC, right, where it's an incredible act of faith to believe in what's going on in the LHC because of the number of components that are involved in that. And there's a massive separation within the experimental world itself, where you've got statisticians, computer modelers, the theorists, the ones that are designing the mirrors and the lasers. It's a massive act of faith, and it seems to be detached very heavily from the right again. You're not really in contact with the world at that point, either with string theory or with the supposed experiments that are supposed to be putting us in touch with the world.
I mean, do you think that that is inevitable? Because we're dealing at that level with things where experience is very remote from the normal way in which we judge things. We have to suspend all our preconceptions. But the trouble is, if you suspend them all, it's very hard to have any purchase on it at all, and hence you get proliferations of an infinite number of universes and so on, for which there isn't a scrap of evidence. It is an area that's sort of prone to that kind of thinking. But
I mean,
yes. Go on.
It fits in a little bit to the business on the flow of time as well. I mean, we've got into such a situation where we are now told by the scientists to ignore experience first. Ignore experience. There is no time. There's no flow of time. And in present day physics, quantum gravity, there's literally no time whatsoever, no time variable even. So you're being asked to reject everything that is right, the right hemisphere, on the basis of a model. So it's gone to a really extreme limit. I mean, you mentioned some of this, right, when you're talking about Einstein and Bergson. their debate.
Yes.
Where
I mean, the reason I talked about Bergson as the main topic of the lecture I gave at the APA meeting was that he is an example of somebody who was very committed to getting his hands dirty. I mean, he was very interested in neurology and at one point thought he was trained in medicine. But he was, in that sense, a brilliant witness to experience at the same time as trying to create a cohesive theory out of it. I mean, it's a shame that he's become totally misunderstood, and there's a caricature version of him that floats around in people's minds unless they really actually engage with him. But yeah, I think that the trouble is that it's not just in science, but in the world around us now, that theory trumps experience. There are all kinds of completely unevidenced ideas that are taken as so true that even to question them is to court being, an outcast. And that's extraordinary because these ideas are completely incompatible with anything that we know from living and from science. So there is a worry that we now live in a world of theory in which whatever the theory says is right, despite what we actually see with our eyes and understand. And, there's that lovely, I probably haven't the time to describe it all, but that really beautifully conceived experiment in which people were asked about a syllogism in which one of the premises is false. And they were asked to look at that syllogism in three conditions. One, in the normal intact state. Secondly, with just the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere having been suppressed. And thirdly, the other way around, just with the right hemisphere. And this is done 3 times by 15 subjects. And the same subjects report differently on the answer to is this syllogism, or is this conclusion true or false? And I think it would take up too much of our time to explain it. But the point at issue is that with the brain intact and with the right hemisphere, people quite correctly say the conclusion is false because they know it to be false. Yeah. But with the left hemisphere only, they say it is true, the conclusion. And even when the examiner says to them, but you know that this isn't the case, don't you? And they go, well, yes. Well, why do you say it's true? Because that's what's written on this piece of paper. So the piece of paper, the representation of reality, the theoretical construct, the map, trumps the actual business of living. And in some ways, this is a very important distinction between the right and left hemisphere, that the right hemisphere is constantly going backwards and forwards between experience and its understanding of it. But the left hemisphere only has the construct of its own making, and it's only happy with it if it is coherent with what it has made, if you like. And so there is a potential war between the left hemisphere and evidence, as it were, whereas the right hemisphere is guided very much by empirical, the business of living and intelligently understanding one's experience.
I mean, Einstein's a curious case in his debate with Bergson because he's on the borderline of an integrated, hemispherically integrated view in his theories, because he's always trying to do it from the point of view of an experiencer. So he has the observer in there, and he's kind of saying, imagine you are on a train, and then you see this. So he tries to integrate it, even in general relativity. Imagine you're in an elevator, and imagine you feel the force on your feet and force of gravity. So he was always trying to express it like that. But then once Einstein had gone, well, the models became purely abstract mathematical systems. And in fact, even Einstein in his later work was then trying to get a logically closed system, which then becomes very left, which is unfortunate. Yes. I don't know what happened with him there. He sort of seemed to switch a bit, probably his Spinoza inclinations.
Yes. Well, that is quite probably right. But I think you're, absolutely right to draw attention to the closed nature of this self-consistent system rather than living more honestly and more honourably with the uncomfortable nature of the fact that one can't finally know. And you know, the whole idea of spooky action at a distance is a way of saying, well, I'm not even going to think about that because it's silly. But you know, that is not a scientific position.
So, I mean, so now I think about it. So those, so Einstein gives there something like an integrated view, right? And I'm wondering if there are other examples. I mean, how do you present more integrated views of various fields? Because we want a solution. You want a solution ultimately, right? Which is going to bring in right hemisphere thinking. And I noticed that you're a fan of Jan Zwicky. And her books are almost models for your hemisphere hypothesis and a solution, because in her lyric philosophy, which I've read recently,
yes,
she has on one side, I'll get them mixed up, but on the on the left side for the right hemisphere, she has symbolic kind of content. And on the facing page, she has the rigorous sort of conceptual content for the left hemisphere. So there's an almost sort of perfect way of battling against the left hemisphere's dominance. Do you know any other sort of examples like this? I mean, how do you go about resolving the problem?
Yes, well, I suppose Jan would say that you can't sort of prove it, but you can point people to things that illuminate a certain position. And I think she does that brilliantly. And the whole idea of music, which is in the background of lyric, and she is a very fine musician. I think the image of music is not enough taken seriously in philosophy as a way of resolving some of these problems. It was certainly something that Bergson came back to, and Nietzsche, but there we go. So I think there's a necessity to show that the rigorous conceptual way of thinking is one way of thinking and not a negligible one. There is nothing wrong with it. The problem comes about when it becomes the master theory and doesn't allow for anything else in there. It sees less, as I demonstrate in part one of the matter with things. The left hemisphere attends less well, perceives less well, makes poorer judgments, in fact delusional judgments on the basis of what it's gleaned. It is less emotionally and socially intelligent, less cognitively intelligent, which surprises some people, but it is, and that it's therefore out of touch with what's going on. So it's not the one that should be making the goals for us or overseeing it. It hasn't the capacity to do that. What it has the capacity to do is rather like a very good computer. It can deal with stuff according to rules that are familiar to it and process data. But that is not a way of reaching a solution. The solution, if you like, if you want to talk in terms of solutions, which probably there never can be in philosophy, is something that is a matter of understanding, taking into account all manner of things that one knows here. And the more you cut off things that you will allow to be types of evidence, the more you're likely to make a mistake. And particularly if you rely simply on the theoretical. It reminds me of the story that I relate in the matter with things sent to me by a colleague, a doctor in America, who had a friend who's got the message that her husband had died in a mining accident, and she went to the hospital and was taken to the morgue, and the compartment in the freezer was slid open, and there indeed was her husband. And of course she bent to kiss him, and she thought, that's funny, he seems slightly warmer than he ought to be. And felt his wrist and thought there was a slow pulse. And she went over to the nurse, that obviously got to be a nurse in attendance, and said, I think my brother might just be alive. And the nurse said, don't you worry about that, my dear. It says quite clearly on this list that he's dead. But she didn't take that as evidence. She went out into the corridor and nabbed a passing doctor who came in and gave the husband intracardiac adrenaline, and he lived. So it's very important that we keep going backwards and forwards between these two positions. The theoretical can help constrain certain things in certain ways, but it can never be the last word. And when it is no longer helpful, then that position needs to be discarded and a new one established. In a way, science is, is the history of perpetual mistakenness. That's not a way of being disrespectful about science, but science moves on, it evolves, it changes, and so what it believes today is something it will know not to be the case tomorrow. So we need to be equally flexible about the whole way in which we approach the big questions, and I think they can't be answered by any one methodology, that we need to bring together different streams of evidence, in short.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously getting worse now because it's sort of crumbling truth away as well, the idea of outsourcing knowledge to large language models, which people do a tremendous amount now, even in universities.
Yes.
My colleagues and whatnot will refer and use large language models for facts, knowing full well these things hallucinate. I mean, it's very well known. And even if they didn't, why outsource your creative capacities anyway? I don't understand it myself, but it seems to be an emerging theme. On the a different kind of split that you go into a little bit is the split that seemed to happen at the end of last century as well, with respect to art and music and architecture and modernism, the emergence of modernism and the breaking of tonality and these kind of things. And you seem to suggest that it was a right-hand deficit, a right hemisphere deficit, and so driven by the left. But I'm not so sure about that. So, because you say elsewhere that the left wants sameness, likes sameness, and the right wants newness. So I would read it as atonality and modernism being left deficits and right driven. And it sort of fits other things that you say, in fact, about asymmetry, right? The need for asymmetry to prevent stagnation. Because what can happen, and what did happen probably, was at the end of the 1800s, all of the various forms of architecture and musical forms and sonata form have been so unbelievably overused that they'd stagnated. So that I view it as a right hemisphere sort of disruption to generate some chaos so that a new form could be built afterwards. And I don't think it was essentially good, some of the stuff that came from the initial breaking of tonality, but it was almost like it had to happen so that the new versions, the new kind of creative products could come out of it. What do you make of that?
I see what you're getting at there, and it enables me to make, I think, an important distinction between, because I have to use some words, I make a distinction between newness and novelty. So newness is literally something that is fresh, whereas novelty can be a gimmick. So somewhere I use the image of a certain kind of child's book that I remember my children have, in which the pages are divided into three, and you can put together the head of one animal with the body of a second and the tail of a third. That is novelty, but it is not truly creative. It is not what I mean by the new. And also the right also has a different attitude to the familiar. So in the right, it has the idea of familiarity is something that you know repeatedly, that you get to know but never finally know. It's like, its root is familia, a household, And it's like you know this household, but it doesn't mean that you've pinned down everything in that household and what all the people are, but at least you know them. Whereas to the left hemisphere, familiarity means the exact same, reproducible, stale, and dead. So the familiar can be alive and vibrant, as in the right hemisphere take on it, or it can be dead and fixed in the sense of the left hemisphere. And novelty can be meretricious and theoretically induced, as in the left hemisphere, or it can be evolving organically, as in the right hemisphere. So what I would say to people who say, well, there needed to be a change, is yes, but what makes you think that music has not changed dramatically without any one person making a theoretical, dogmatic, doctrinaire stand and saying, right, we're going to do away with tonality? Things have crept forward, but actually at an amazing pace since music in the 14th century, the 15th century, the 16th century, the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century. You can see the evolution of music, and if given a piece of music, you can say, where does it come from in the history? It changes in a naturally evolving way. But what happened was, for the first time, everyone got together and said, for a purely abstract theoretical reason, we're going to just break the past and we're going to throw away everything that has come down to us. This was the mistake in architecture, in music, in whatever. I'm not opposed to the idea that things evolve. I'm very conscious that they must evolve or die. And people misunderstand a tradition or a culture. A culture is always live and growing and changing. And a tradition is literally handing down from, one generation to the next, something. But each time it's handed down, it is reimagined by the people who take it on. It's not static. And I sometimes use here the image of, if you want to train a plant to grow up a wall, it's no good sort of uprooting it from a flower bed and sticking it on the wall where you want it to go. You have to make it actually grow up the wall, and it can be done very easily if you're a good gardener. And I think this is the point, that dogmatic break, that schism with the past was, set art back 400 years, really. It's recovering now. I mean, I'm glad to say that music and architecture and so on are beginning to discover things that are, genuinely imaginative and new, but are not as alien as they were. I mean, in the book somewhere, I quote Schoenberg, who said, talking about music, what it sounds like is not the point. Well, the only thing that music is what it sounds like, if you like, and that may include mathematics and so on. You can be aware of it, but the fact is that to say that is absurd. And very clearly, in his earlier pre-dogmatic work, what it sounded like was very important to him.
Well, exactly. I mean, Schoenberg was definitely very left-brained. It was all about the theoretical model of music and taking music to what he thought was its limit, its theoretical limit, yes. Despite it sounding awful. And, probably the same with architecture. I mean, I wonder what happened there. So there were all kinds of splits, and it was a chaotic time. And I've been thinking, one of my current projects is to try and trace the break in architectural styles and musical styles to trauma. And it's almost as if the right hemisphere is trying to make itself seen almost by throwing it onto the world, because it's not being processed by the left. So it almost externalizes it onto the architecture, showing its wound. And there's a cognitive architect, she calls herself, Anne Sussman, who looked at Walter Gropius's early Bauhaus designs and showed that they were identical to his trench building in World War I. So he was basically just recreating over and over again his World War I traumatic experiences. So, there's a possible explanation maybe for why suddenly everything seemed to go bad.
It's an interesting observation, but I'm afraid I remain unconvinced. Partly I think that the modern emphasis on trauma as explaining just about everything is a huge exaggeration. there are things that are genuinely traumatic, and I've treated people who saw their children tortured in front of their eyes. I mean, but nowadays everybody's had trauma. I mean, literally everybody. And I do think this is nonsense. We're far more resilient than that. It's a way of fostering the idea that we have no agency of ourselves, that it has been taken away from us. It culminates in ghastly things like Sapolsky's new book, Determined, which spreads a fatalistic view of what it is to be a human being that I think is both demonstrably wrong and immoral, because it actually helps destroy human agency, freedom, and hope. So I don't think that is right. I don't think it's the right hemisphere asking to be expressed. I think what happened was we reached a point of intellectualism in which we thought that our take on the world was superior to anything that nature herself had given us. And we still live in that world in which there are palpable attacks on nature in every form going on all around us. I mean, the one on the environment is enormous and very familiar, but there are other attacks on the human body, and the idea that we'd be better if we were disembodied and that we were somewhere in a cloud or part of a machine, or the very idea that there is no difference between a man and a woman, one of the most wonderful and creative differences in the whole of history, is another extraordinary idea that is rooted in the idea we make it all up. We can make it any way we like. And it's very difficult to nowadays, because everybody thinks that if you criticize one position, you're going to another extreme position. And it's really critically important to realize that is not the case, that you often have to hold two things in conjunction. In short, we are not entirely free. We can't do exactly as we like, and it's just as well that we can't. But on the other hand, we do have freedom. We can make choices, and we do make those choices. And I don't believe at all that these are somehow predetermined by the cosmos, by physics, or by biology. There are influences there. So it's neither one nor the other, and even that is stigmatized these days by, I can't remember what they call it, but there is a term sort of meaning, centrism or something, but really it's a kind of wisdom, and it's the way in which I see the coincidence of opposites as so important in understanding our experience, and indeed understanding the physical world. I don't know if you'd agree. So the idea is that there is a tension between a thing and its opposite, and one can't exist without the other, just as you can't have a magnet with only a North Pole. It has to have a South Pole. And those two things co-create one another and need to be held together. And they may look like opposites, but we need them both. And Heraclitus makes this point that they create a tension, and out of that tension comes the creation. So no tension, no creation. No tension in the string of the bow, no arrow can fly. No tension in the string of the lyre, no music can come forth.
Yep. No, it's a very Goethean viewpoint, which I agree with. I mean, there's a nice quote from C.G. Jung where he's talking about the Pueblo Indians. And he's mentioning, in the essay, he mentions Quetzalcoatl, and he says the gods are anxious that humans inhabit the earth. Well, why? Well, in order that it's perceived, right? He also says elsewhere that the psyche is the sine qua non as the world as an object. You don't have a world as an object without a subject that is reflecting it. It just doesn't exist. Doesn't mean one is primary or before the other. So that they are bound together in almost like a magnet with its north and south pole.
Wonderful. That's so right. And, to go a little bit far from this, I mean, I think in short that the reason that there is a cosmos at all is that whatever grounds it, the ungrounded ground, the ground of being, whatever you like to call it, needed to create out of that singleness, something other that to which it can relate, because everything is relational, and that relation is one in which both the ground of being and the creation come to know one another better. It is an evolving dance of ever-increasing self-knowledge, if you like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's an important position in many older views. Obviously, in Sufi religion, it's the entire basis of the creation of humans is to be mirrors. And the idea is that your role as a human is to polish yourself as perfectly as possible so God can see himself as well as possible in you, which is rather nice.
I quite like that, but and I'm a great admirer of Sufism, but I think that I would tweak it a little and say that it is never just as simple as a reflection, if you see what I mean, because we enter into it in a way that the mirror doesn't enter into what it mirrors, if you like.
Yeah, yeah. And if it's just a simple mirror, it almost implies that there was something there beforehand and it's just being reflected.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important to stress. I think that from my reading of your work, I think we share this view that potential is something that is not already fixed. It is not sort of not yet actualized, but as I put it in one place, sitting in a cupboard somewhere, ready to be taken out, dusted off, and put in the living room of reality. It's not like that. What potential is unknown, because by its essence, it is unknowable. It is something that contains the power for something to come into being, but not the directions as to what it is. And you know, and that's almost an answer to the idea. You know, how come that a God that can be seen as in any sense benign would allow certain things to happen in the cosmos that whatever created?
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazingly complicated thing to discuss, and you can see why Heidegger got so messed up with these kinds of ideas. But you find it in the origins of philosophy, right? In the debates that Parmenides was having with Anaximander. So they were both claiming to be monists, right? There's just one thing, but then Anaximander was saying, no, but there is this sort of generation of opposites that comes from the one thing. And Parmenides would say, well, they must have been in there already then. If they weren't there, then it's creation from nothing, and that's impossible. So they must have been there. So you're a pluralist. Therefore, there's literally just one thing.
But what about if there was a one and a many that are just different ways of imagining the same thing? Well, that's I believe that the one and the many are not two separate things. They're one that is, to use a Bohmian idea, implicit, and one which is explicit. In other words, folded inwards and folded outwards.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the viewpoint in the dual aspect monism book that I released with Harold Atmanspacher not so long ago, and we have Bohm in there as a potential dual aspect monist. And the idea is that you're taking views of the one thing, but the views are not separate from the one thing. They're not sort of separated off from it. They're epistemic, we call them. There's an ontic oneness with epistemic manyness.
Yes, that's a very nice way of putting it. Yes, I like that. No, that is right. But episteme can see a one as well. I mean, it's capable of seeing one. It's also capable of seeing many. But ontologically, they are united. They're not separate. Which is why I use that Hegelian image of the bud that unfurls into a flower. And by becoming a flower, it hasn't negated the bud. It has fulfilled the bud. And the flower then goes on to become the fruit. And the fruit is not a negation of the flower, it's the fulfillment of that. So if you see things in terms of a never-ending process, a flow, which I do, then a lot of the problems that arise from stasis, which I think Parmenides got stuck in, become more tractable.
Yeah, I mean, that's almost like the Hegelian solution, right, which Bohm was using. Bohm was a complete Hegelian. He walked around with logic of science everywhere he went, apparently. And what he was doing there was was trying to, it was on his deathbed, he was holding it still. He was trying to reconcile the one and the many, basically. And you reconcile it by having becoming, right? Being and nothingness get resolved by becoming, where it's constantly evolving from, Okay. I mean, you mentioned somebody who has a slightly similar view. You mentioned Galen Strawson, he's a dual aspect monist, and he has this idea that mind and matter, and he uses the metaphor, and I think you use it as well, as two sides of the same coin. But I have an issue with the two sides of the same coin idea, because it suggests a sort of too much substantialness, too much rot, i.e. really out there, to use your own term from elsewhere. Whereas the idea that you pursue quite a lot in these books is that, I mean, there is really no coin. There's no coin. There's no two sides. There's something more ultimate that is being created. The pair create each other, which is very different from the two sides of a coin, right? Maybe
I do agree, and I will try and search out where I said that, if I did, because it doesn't really represent my position. I believe that the fundamental whatever is consciousness. That consciousness is that which you cannot go behind. It is an ontological primitive. And my view of matter is that it is something that is in consciousness as an aspect of consciousness. So they're not two sides of the same coin, but consciousness is always manifesting in different ways. It is never static. It is always also directional. It is always consciousness of something. If the consciousness is not of something, then it isn't consciousness. So there is a necessary relational nature and a necessary changeability. But sometimes it is good to have an element of relative resistance to change that leads to a degree of permanence for a short while, and something that also, and this is very important, presents opposition, because I believe that creation inherently needs a drive and an opposition. I mean, that would be in keeping with all the philosophers that I admire, going back to Heraclitus and so on. So Empedocles and forwards to the early 19th century with people like Hegel and so on. So what that is that consciousness takes on a certain kind of reality in certain places and at certain moments, and that is a degree of difference. And yes, it looks colossally different from consciousness. I mean, the immediate reaction is, but, consciousness is not like matter. They just don't look the same. And, I apologize, but I use the image from water. Water is transparent and translucent and moves over your hand, and there's no problem with it. But then there's this other stuff which is incredibly hard and is opaque and won't go anywhere until it's given a push. And what is it? It's ice. Well, what is ice? It's water, basically, in another phase. And then, in this room, there are literally tons of water vapor, because if there weren't, I couldn't live. And you can't even see it, never mind compare it with water or ice. But they are all different phases of water, and I think that consciousness has these different phases. What do you think about that?
I mean, my view is that in grounding it in consciousness, there's still too much substantialness to it almost. There's still too much being to it, to consciousness. Okay. This is why I like it when you start to go into the potentiality. Potentiality is, it's what the mystics would say is being beyond being and non-being. Meister Eckhart. I think where I look is there, and Schelling's Godhead. Schelling's Godhead has the ground for things existing and not existing. because it has literally nothing within it. So I would say that is the fundamental stuff, and consciousness and matter are requirements of, as you said earlier, making itself manifest to itself. So I would put the core of things at that level of potentiality. And it seems now and again you say pretty much that.
I wouldn't at all disagree with that. Very importantly, in the title of that book is The Matter with Things, the way in which we thingify things that can't be thingified. And one of them is consciousness. So it isn't a thing, and it isn't even a container. So there is nothing, as it were, sort of in consciousness. But if one had to put a name for the thing that is generative, because generation must come from something, even if that something is described as a nothing, because it has no features at the moment. But it clearly does have potential. I mean, that is one thing for sure. So perhaps one could say that consciousness is a field that is completely potential, but that is capable of actualization. And the business of the cosmos is precisely that, the actualization of elements of potential, which then go back into the field of, they alter our conception of what the potential is, and therefore of the choices that we make. And this is really what Whitehead was saying, that, you know, that becoming generates actual occasions, which are the things that are added to the field of experience and become meat for further creation. And I think that is why Bohm thought there was not just an unfolding in the cosmos, but a re-enfolding, which led to a further unfolding, so that these nested moments of division and union. And this is exactly what Goethe says, and I think we both have gravitated to this, the idea of, you know, his wonderful saying, dividing the united, uniting the divided is the whole work of nature. And I think by nature he didn't just mean the living world, but actually of all that exists. So I don't think we... Thank you for that kind of reflection, and I may not have properly taken that into account, but it does represent better my position.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the earlier Bohm, Jakob Boehmer, who has the same thing, right? The exhalation and inhalation. But no, I agree that there is this strange feedback going on where seems to be an evolution, which is very present in David Bohm's view. It's the cosmos learning. A learning process, essentially.
It absolutely is. No, it is an unfolding, an evolution, and an evolution means pretty much that things come out of the turning of things and become actualized. And to make it very day to day, you know, money is nothing. I mean, money only has meaning when it's spent. And it's just a pile of potential, and what it could become is infinite. I mean, you can spend money in an almost infinite number of ways, and so potentially it is many, 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 many things. But how it is actualized makes a difference, and how we spend our lives matters. I think this is an important point, that the role of the human is in part of creation. I think you say something like this in your writing as well, that we play this significant role in that what we do with what we've been given, how we use it to illuminate the things that are real, that are true and are good and are beautiful, is in a way what we're here to do. And to the extent that we don't do that, we're somehow wasting that potential.
Yeah, I mean, this goes right to to the business of attention. Right, what we are doing is assigning meaning to the world, and essentially we're cosmogonical beings who are bringing worlds into being. But the problem is, as you make clear, there are two ways of doing that. One is not so nice, and you produce a machine that loses all of its life and creativity, and the other, you have an organic, relational kind of picture. But they're both bringing in worlds. And it's interesting. I mean, you speak of it sometimes as a war. And essentially what you have is a war of the worlds, right? There's one world which is, I mean, I was going to mention some of you go in a little bit now and again to esoteric aspects, but there's almost an esoteric connection to the left and the right, and the east and the west, and the old and the new. You know, you think of the left would be associated with something like Mars and the Romans and the newness and bringing something new, and then you've got the German, the old, corresponding to the other hemisphere, and you've got a real actual war of the worlds. And it's interesting that H.G. Wells chose the Martians, who were associated with, obviously, Romulus. Mars was the father of Romulus and the new, and the Romans. Curious links.
Well, what I would want to say about that is, and forgive me, I can't let it just pass, is that there is a war as viewed from the left hemisphere's standpoint. It sees itself as standing in opposition to the right hemisphere. It sees itself as competitive with the right hemisphere. And if one wishes to anthropomorphize, and I think that in a way there are problems with it, but there's a much bigger problem with not doing so, since the hemispheres are tangibly parts of people. And the left hemisphere has a kind of resentment of the power of the right hemisphere, but the right hemisphere doesn't see it as a war at all. It sees this as a complete unnecessary conflict. It sees that the two should work together. And this is behind a different war, which is the war that Milton wrote about in Paradise Lost, between God and his brightest angel, Lucifer, the light bringer. And, you know, there was no reason for Lucifer to fall away from God, except that he had this antagonistic view that his power was limited by God, and he didn't like that. And as a result, he fell and became the lord of the underworld, with very different values and goals. And I you know, of course it is a myth, but then it is a myth that myths are purely fantastical. Myths are, and this was the original meaning of the word muthos in early Greek, these are the ways in which we alone can understand the truly great truths. The mean, everyday, simple truths can be worked out by logic, but the big ones really need myths.
Yeah. Also in Milton's Paradise Lost, there is a sector of the fallen angels who basically become philosophers, and they are, and William James uses this line in his little book on problems of philosophy, they are wandering mazes lost. They basically created systems of thought for themselves and locked themselves in their own labyrinths of the mind, and they're torturing themselves in obsessions going around. So that's what can happen if you...
It's just a warning.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sorry, but it's just so interesting. I mean, I see that there are different kinds of philosophy, and you've mentioned Eastern traditions, but I'd also mention the phenomenological tradition in Europe in the last 100 years, which are much more balanced in their hemispheric input than Anglo-American analytic philosophy, which relies purely on left hemisphere processes and won't allow anything else. And if it can't be put in language, it doesn't exist. If it's not, discoverable by fragmenting it into its parts, then it doesn't mean anything. But this is the wrong place to be starting on a path to wisdom. Of course, the way to get round that, when you say this to philosophers, philosophy's got nothing to do with wisdom. It's not the love of wisdom at all. Well, what is it then? It's a bunch of people in university departments having arguments with one another that leave most people who do think rather cold.
Yeah, the standard definition that a modern Anglo-American philosopher will give for their discipline is the clarification of concepts, which is very left, because the whole problem is you can't do everything just with concepts, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's non-conceptual that you're not going to grasp.
And also in clarifying it, you will change it.
Yeah. But on the phenomenologists, it shows you that there's you can do right hemisphere work in a systematic fashion. So Husserl's studies of temporal experience are just as, you can call them just as scientific as the other kinds of science. They're rigorous. It's just that they're introspective. He's looking at his own inner experience and looking for principles and laws and regularities in there, and they are there.
Yes.
And I mean, there's an interesting link to music analysis as well in that era. There's a music analyst called Heinrich Schenker, who you might know. He was a student of Bruckner. You know Bruckner. I know you like Bruckner. And he bases an entire system of music analysis based on gestalt, which is obviously a huge part of your system as well. So the idea is that you start with the huge theme, the absolute largest theme, the Ursatz, and then you work through it using Husserlian type methods, phenomenological methods, through structural layers. So it gives you an entirely upside down, relative to how we usually do analysis, way of thinking about things like music in the world.
I hadn't come across Schenker's saying this, and it's interesting. But I do think the inversion of the process is very important, that, wholes are what exist, parts are what we make. And the idea that you make a whole by putting together what we have created, namely the parts, is a vast mistake, which lies behind a lot of the problems that we now experience.
Yep. How are you feeling so far? Are you happy to continue and go through some more?
Yeah, I am. Yes, I'm enjoying it. I hope you are.
Oh yes, of course. Okay, I mean, you mentioned the business of the whole and the parts there, and I'm thinking of Julian James's bicameral mind, and the way he presents things there is as if the older Homerian humans were heavily left hemispheric. And it's interesting that you talk about parts, because the way he describes the characters is as if they are just parts. That what they're seeing is really just body parts and not even whole humans. So I know you differ in your views from James's book, and obviously his other view is that previously in those days everything was viewed as external, and the idea was that they thought it was the gods speaking to them, and they had no introspection yet. So his view is, as soon as we get introspection, then we generate consciousness. That's where consciousness emerges from, the ability to introspect and taking the gods from the outside and putting them in our heads. That would suggest that the more primitive condition, curiously, would be left hemispheric, whereas reading your work, the natural conclusion would be more to say that the right is the more primordial kind of system. What do you make of that?
Well, I have a problem with the equation of consciousness with self-consciousness. Otherwise, one's left with the idea that a dog is not conscious, which I would resist. And indeed, I think consciousness goes all the way down to single-celled organisms, which behave in a remarkably intelligent way, ways in which they cannot be programmed in any sense. So I think consciousness is there all along. But James thought that what happened was somehow the division of the brain was an opening of a door, and I think there was a closing of the door between the hemispheres, and it was this that made people suddenly think that their own thoughts must be coming from somewhere else, and this is what happens in schizophrenia, where people. Yeah. I'm not saying that, wise religious leaders had schizophrenia, of course, but I'm just suggesting that his idea that it comes from an opening of the door so you could hear these things for the first time is wrong, because before there was such a profound division between the left and right hemisphere, they were more in touch with one another anyway. So this dichotomy of the left and right hemisphere wasn't anything like as marked. And I would see them as unself-consciously informing one another. But I think that what we've done, probably one of the reasons that the division has become more marked, as it did at this moment, whenever it was, 800 BC or whatever, around the world, when suddenly there seemed to be manifestations of a certain way of looking at the cosmos. We bring together things from Chinese, Hindu, European, and so on during a certain quite short period. I think what's happening is that this ability to introspect, to have an observing eye inside you that is observing you, is a relatively new phenomenon, and not necessarily a very healthy phenomenon. It is the phenomenon that ultimately leads to various rather abstract kinds of philosophy, which can be seen as, I tentatively suggest, relatively benign forms of a psychopathology, in which one is too detached from experience, mm-hmm. and one needs to be both embedded in experience and able to inspect it, which sounds a very difficult thing to do, and is a very difficult thing to do, but that is what is meant by having the balanced use of the two hemispheres. But I certainly wouldn't accept that earlier man, whatever one calls it, was largely left hemisphere dominated. I don't think that that's true at all.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, it seems to me that what was going on back then, and what still happens in some quite primitive tribes, is that there's a more of a connected engagement with the world. And there's Levi Brawl's term participation, mystical participation, right?
Yes,
where you're so engaged in it that what you do matters to the world.
Yes.
And so probably that is what was going on back then. And obviously...
No, and that relation to the importance of it being a participatory universe, to quote John Archibald Wheeler, it is something that I think you and I would also embrace. That one of the problems is that we thought that somehow it's independent of us, and trying to articulate that in a way in which people don't mistake you for either a naive idealist or a naive realist is difficult but very important.
Yeah, I mean, I like the way you sort of navigate the path. I mean, it's a very difficult path to navigate between your naive idealism, which you call Mombo, and naive realism, which is rot. Because you're not saying either. You don't want to be on either of those ledges. It's a Scylla and Charybdis situation. But people want to put you in one or the other categories, which is obviously a left hemisphere kind of thing to do. So Wheeler himself claimed to have been driven mad from trying to figure out what his view was. Like, what was the ontology here? If there's no way the world is out there until I've decided what question to ask, well, what kind of ontology is that? Like, what is the picture of the world that you can give? And he couldn't come up with it. And he was trying to find all sorts of approaches like pre-geometry and logic, propositional calculus, and he could never resolve that problem. In the end, the best he did was to come up with something similar to what you're saying. You use Escher's drawing hands to try and explain it. The picture Escher's drawing hands, which is similar to the picture he gave of the giant letter U with the eyeball observing itself, bringing itself into existence.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's
interestingly, just as an aside, I remember my son James, when he was about 3, saying, "So how did God come into being?" And then he answered it himself, and he said, "Perhaps he was just at first a hand, and he drew himself in." I thought, crikey. But that is in essence, not a bad attempt for a 3-year-old at seeing that process of generation. Can we help to resolve it by talking about a very special kind of nothing? So we don't want to call it a something, because that is too definite, even if we leave the something undefined, I suppose. But a nothing that is full of potential. And I think that people misunderstand a very central concept in Chinese and Japanese philosophy, which is shunyata, which is translated into English as emptiness, but is not emptiness as we know it. Emptiness means utter vacancy, but emptiness in this case is a field that is so receptive that it can produce anything. It is a field where something can grow, and nothing is yet growing until it interacts with something that asks it for something. So the asking of the question is the interaction, and it brings forth an answer to that question. If you'd asked a different question, it would bring forth a different answer. And I think that may well be a very important thing to bear in mind. And you talk about this in your work. I know that it matters extraordinarily which questions we ask, and therefore science has a responsibility to be asking. At least it has a responsibility to be asking certain questions, or not to forbid anybody else asking them. I mean, it may say, well, that's not a question for me. I can't assess it in any way. But unfortunately, some scientists, not the best ones, I know, but some of the sort of lesser minds, think that anything that can't be grasped by science just doesn't exist. And there is no role for philosophers and theologians, but I think that is a basic error.
Yeah, what is interesting about this view that you're describing is that it's a view where responsibility is put back on people, on humans,
yes,
for creating their world. Even their questions are so important that they can make the world go one way or another way. So you have to be hugely careful of what you're doing. And it goes back to what you said earlier about Robert Sapolsky. There's a moral responsibility on casting questions into the world, basically, because you are co-creating the thing as you go along. And this is what we've, I think, forgotten. It leads, it's part of the disenchanted world that we find right now. Okay, so where were we?
What were we talking about? Yes.
I don't know. It was quite exciting. We were talking about participatory responsibility.
Oh, yes, very much so, yes.
Ontology. Yeah.
Yes.
So, what is your take on this?
Well, my take is that we can't get away from the fact that every experience, not just mystical experiences or whatever, is an encounter. It is an encounter with whatever is within me as conventionally thought of, and whatever is not within me. So the inner and the outer. And that, in fact, the whole idea of the inner and the outer may be a mistake, that these are fundamentally connected as the poles of the magnet suggest, that they exist together, and it's out of their coming together that you get a magnet, and it's out of their coming together that we get a world, if you like, to put it that way. So I do think that we play an important moral role. I say attention is a moral act, because how you dispose your attention to the world dictates what comes about. Obviously, what comes about for you and changes the way you think, but I believe it also has an impact, however small, on the sum of things, that something has been realized there, which is part of what the experiential world is for all of us. So there is a huge and rather exhilarating responsibility to do one's best to react with cognizance of and honouring of what I consider the lures by which we are made to move forward, that we don't progress because we're pushed from behind by a blind force, but we move forward because we are lured from in front by what Aristotle would have called a final cause, a something that tells us where to go. And I think that, you can tell me whether there's anything in physics that would support that, but I think now in biology it's becoming clear that all is not a matter of being pushed from behind by predictable paths at all, but by form fields that help to influence the way in which something develops. And I suspect from my non-specialist reading of physics that something of the kind can be said about the so-called inanimate world.
Yeah, so you're referring to Michael Levin's work.
There I was referring on the biology to Michael Levin's work,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, I mean, in physics, I mean, you've mentioned it already, it's the entanglement. In entangled systems, you have to deal with the holistic state because it's in exactly the situation of the drawing hands. Until you've decided to ask a question, it doesn't know what it is yet. It doesn't know whether it's going to manifest spin in this direction or this axis or this axis. And because of the spooky action at a distance, you can't say that they already had their values. You are forbidden from having a ROT, an ROT, really out there view in quantum mechanics. This is why your attention view plus quantum mechanics makes it sort of cosmically moral. You're really having a serious impact on the nature of the world, sort of in a more sort of larger sense.
I mean, I use the instance of a rather beautiful drawing which either shows a plant or shows a woman's face, and you can't see them both at the same time. You can only choose to see one or the other. And when you choose to see one, all the parts become different. When you see it as a plant, you see a petal, you see a butterfly, and so on. But when you see it as a woman's face, you see a mouth and a nose and whatever. So these things inevitably alter because they alter at once, because the changes are as a whole. Another instance might be when people get married. The fact that somebody becomes a husband doesn't cause somebody else to become a wife or vice versa. The fact is that by the act of marriage, they inevitably become husband and wife, if you see what I mean. Yeah. So,
It's what they used to call a Cambridge change.
A Cambridge change?
A Cambridge change, yeah. I mean, this picture you mentioned sounds like a perfect description of quantum mechanics and the double slit experiment, where this is precisely what's happening, right? You can either detect the position, the local context, or you can detect the momentum, the global context, but not both at the same time. So there's a switch, and the world will adjust itself according to which one you decide to measure, which reminds me a little bit of of your explanation for the development of hemispheres. Right, there's this sort of view that it's so you can eat without being eaten. Where the situation again is this sort of duplication that you have to split the system into two, because it's again you can't do both simultaneously. It's almost like an uncertainty principle for eating.
You simply can't, with one coherent neuronal mass, pay very detailed attention to some little thing in the picture and at the same time keep an eye open for everything else. So you need two, yeah.
Which is interesting from the point of view of the world. So the world is in this sort of strange state where it's neither in a position or momentum state until you've asked the question. It doesn't seem to split itself into two, but it does seem to require a second thing, i.e. the participant, to put it into some kind of order. I'm wondering if there's some sort of link there.
Well, I mean, one important difference is that the left hemisphere is not really connected to the world. It only observes as through a glass darkly, as through a window in a hermetically sealed room, whereas the right hemisphere is actually in touch with reality, so it is more connected. And I think the right hemisphere has to be foundational in the sense that it is the more important one, but it is also something without which the left hemisphere can't be free to carry out its role. In the myth of the master and his emissary, as I try to explain in the beginning of the book of that title, it is the master, the right hemisphere, that, as it were, appoints the emissary to do a certain job. Just as in Paradise Lost, as it were, Lucifer only is what it is because God appoints that as the chief of the angels, as the greatest of the angels, makes And so, but then it matters what you do with that role, and we're back to this importance of our position, which is, I mean, again, something I've perhaps referred to too often, but the extraordinary richness of an image from the Kabbalah of creation. Do you want me to say anything about that, or?
You can, because, I mean, again, it's got hemispheric structure in itself, right?
It has a hemispheric structure.
Yeah.
So in the Lurianic Kabbalah, the Ein Sof, which is the whatever that grounds everything, needs something else to be related to a creation. And the first act is not to bring something positively into being, but to create a negative space, to create something which is where something other than Ein Sof can actually be, which I think is a brilliant point first off, and is rather in keeping with both of our positions on how things come about. The second thing that happens is that there are vessels that are 12 vessels are placed into the space in order to receive whatever it is that is created. And a single spark comes out of Ein Sof, and it lands on these urns and shatters them, or shatters 8 of them, but we don't need to go into that. And then the third phase is that these vessels are repaired, and this is peculiarly the task of mankind, that we are there to repair those vessels. And when they are repaired, they are more beautiful than they were before they were shattered. So they are somehow only made what they are through having gone through this negative fracturing phase, and then they are remade something greater still. And I think that's so beautiful. And, you know, I always mention the art called kintsugi that the Japanese have of shattering pottery and making it again with these wonderful golden lines that make it more beautiful than it was.
That's beautiful.
But the point I'm emphasizing there is that in that story we have a place here which is to repair something. And that speaks to me rather deeply. And it's also a Christian idea that, you know, there is a redemption of something that can be better, and that part of our job is to, in our little way, to make it better than it was.
Yeah, exactly. There's a purpose in the Kabbalistic approach. I mean, it's basically a soul's journey. And the idea is that you have to go through the darkness in Malkuth and Sofa, learn what is in there, and then take it back up. And it's exactly what you were mentioning earlier about the Goethe idea of the sort of that out-breath and the in-breath, and you're taking something back in there. In this case, it's tikkun, right? I think tikkun is the repair in Kabbalah.
Repair, yes.
Yeah,
that's right.
It's a beautiful system. I mean, but in terms of, I mean, there are many ways that you can generalize the hemispheres hypothesis. I mean, one way might be to physics. This Kabbalistic approach is another way where you have something on either side where it almost corresponds to the qualities of the left and right. In the various sephira, you have mercy and justice, and they almost are like left and right qualities.
They are. There's in the Sephirot there is Bina and Chokhmah, and Bina is the left hemisphere, if you like, and Chokhmah is the right hemisphere. And these dualities sustain one another and are both needed, but ultimately it is Chokhmah that is able to direct. The role of Bina is a constricting one, a restrictive one. And as I say, there is a great deal to be said for resistance. Nothing comes into being without a degree of resistance, which enables it to be what it is, as separate from everything else, of course. So, but they have those two roles. And I quote somewhere Abraham Heschel talking about a very ancient idea, where it's to be found, I'm not sure, but in the Jewish scriptures, of the different, I think it permeates Jewish theology, if you like, is between Halakha and Agadah, that there are these two forces, as it were, that are continually interacting in order to bring things about, and both are required, but one of them, Agadah, is more important than the other one, halakha. Halakha is what brings rules and propositional belief and so on. Agadah is what comes from the heart, from the spirit. And he makes he doesn't, but the text that he quotes is quite nice. It says that when God promised mankind bread and wine, halakha was the bread and agadah was the wine. But these ideas are, of course, they're famously there in the yin and the yang and so forth. So in most cultures, we have this recognition of two principles. And the one that really knocked me for six is that extraordinary myth with which I opened part 3 of The Matter with Things, this myth of an Iroquois people called the Onondaga. And it is so remarkable. It's a creation myth that just bears out just about everything that can be said about the relations between the left and right. It's a story of two brothers, one of them senior and wiser, and the other one more hot-headed, and so on, and how their relationship has to try and bring the work of the junior brother, the headstrong one, under the aegis of the wiser one, so that it can actually take part in creation. But unfortunately, it's headstrong and is destined to go its own way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a nice way of one initial thought I had about the hemisphere hypothesis and the idea of labeling it master and emissary when I first saw your book a long time ago. Was the imbalance there. And the natural thought is, why not a symmetry? Why would we introduce an imbalance? Because that's just going to give us a pendulum and we're going to constantly go back and forth. But the idea is, well, you need a pendulum. The pendulum is what breathes life into the world. And I think in speaking of this Kabbalistic version, you get a nice, and the other one you gave, the Haggadah, Halak, sorry. You can see that I think one of the examples is you temper justice with mercy. So it's always sort of easing one side. So there is in the body of God, which is what the Sephirah are supposed to be, you have that very asymmetry. And it's possible, maybe, I don't know what your view of this is, that it sort of trickles down through various systems. This same asymmetry, in order to get all of the various systems to work, it trickles down through our physical systems and maybe is responsible at a high level for the structure of the hemispheres in the brain.
Yes, I do think so. And I think that in a way that is pleasing, if I'm right, there is a consonance between the structure of the cosmos and the structure of the brain. And that could have two kinds of significance. One might be that because the cosmos is the way it is, the brain that is there to understand it needs to have the same structure. Or the other way of looking at it is that the cosmos seems to have this structure because a brain that has that structure is cognizing it or imagining it. And when I said that, when I was speaking on a platform with Rowan Williams, he quite rightly said, in a very right hemisphere way, why does it have to be either? And it probably doesn't. I think they come together. And I quote in the book both Louis Pasteur for biology and Pierre Curie for physics, saying more or less the same thing, that there may be symmetries in the world or in organisms, but these are not important. What is really important is the asymmetries. Without asymmetries, nothing could be. And I'm, perhaps in a naive way, led to believe that there could not be anything in the universe if there wasn't an asymmetry between the amount of matter and antimatter.
Yep, well, that's the classic unexplained problem, right? Is why that asymmetry occurred. If it didn't, we wouldn't be here. So the best we can do at the moment is give anthropic explanations, which scientists don't like very much, it seems. Yeah. Okay. On the issue of truth, maybe one last topic on the business of truth. So you describe it as an encounter,
exactly,
and there are places where you seem to say that there is it's closer to truth, the right hemisphere, than the left hemisphere. But given some of the things we've just been discussing about how difficult it is to pin down and the ineffability of truth, how can you get any purchase on these kind of claims of being closer to truth without being able to step outside and compare what the right hemisphere is attending to and how it's relating to the world and the world itself, if we want to have the expression the world itself?
No, very, very good. So it has been put to me that how can you know that the right hemisphere is closer to a true vision than the left without there being a third hemisphere to adjudicate? Yeah. But I think this is a fundamental misunderstanding. I'm using an idea that I think is William James's, as presented by the philosopher Susan Hark, that if you put it this way, if you believe things as are false, you will constantly find yourself being caught out by experience. You haven't really grasped what's going on. You'll be constantly mistaken. And that will be obvious to you because, as it were, your plane will crash. What you thought was food won't be food, etc. Whereas if you are at least closer to an idea of what is true, you are less likely to be wrong-footed by experience. So you can't get beyond experience. And I mean, that can also be a problem for science if it wants experience to be without a subject, because without a subject there is no experience and there is no experiment. There needs to be a subject to assess it. And so what I think is that if you followed what the left hemisphere says in a quite simple way, you'd find yourself mistaken, indeed, as we do in the modern world. We're constantly surprised by the way our theory about things is not borne out by events, whereas people who have a wiser vision of reality find themselves not so often caught out by experience. It's not to say that at the end of the day you can pin down what truth is, because as you rightly say, it is in essence something we can never fully know. That's why I say closer to truth. But there has to be an idea of closer to truth, because if there wasn't, you wouldn't have an idea of truth at all. And without truth, there's no point in saying or doing anything at all. We might as well just go to bed and wait to die. Because nothing is truer than anything else. So we all automatically assume that some things are truer than others, even if our idea is that there is no truth. We believe that that is truer than the idea that there is truth. So you can't ever get out of the thing that you are making judgments, truth judgments, all the time. And so I'm saying, if your truth judgments are well grounded, you'll find experience corroborating and accommodating what is coming forth to meet you. Whereas if your assumptions are mistaken, you will find more and more evidence, provided you're prepared to accept it and look at it, that your position has to be wrong.
That sounds quite almost Darwinian. It's saying that what is true is what sort of leads you away from trouble or from injury or from being less successful in the world. But that doesn't strike me as necessarily tracking truth.
Well, it's not the same as the Darwinian point, because my point isn't just that you're safer if you're able to assess what's going on or predict what's likely to happen, but in every department, as it were, even if you believe that what is necessary is to sacrifice yourself for a good end, and to undertake something that is not immediately going to favour your survival, if you believe it to be true, then that is what we mean by truth, not just what is comfortable. And there are many uncomfortable truths. And I think probably the problem I'm thinking of at the moment is that people with certain dogmatic positions find any challenge to that uncomfortable and ask to be protected from it. And that is not a respectable attitude to truth. It is somebody who doesn't care, but just wants everything to conform to their imagination. Now, I mean, take imagination and take fantasy. So the distinction I'm making there is one that was made best, I think, by Coleridge, who wrote very, very well on philosophy. He's a much more interesting writer on philosophy than he was a poet, in my view, unlike Wordsworth. But the idea there is that fantasy is just dressing things up in a way which is pleasing to the eye. But imagination is a way of looking at something with such careful attention that you see into the heart of it. You see what it truly is. So you might stare at a thing until you can actually see it, as it were. I'm not suggesting that staring is the best way to do this. In fact, it's not. But the point about imagination is that it helps to make your vision of things make sense, be integral. It's pragmatist rather than pragmatic. I think you were suggesting that this was a pragmatic way to think, but it's not. It's grounded in the movement of pragmatism. You know, C.S. Peirce and William James and Dewey to some extent, where, as it were, they are always referring philosophy back to experience. And that's something I think we agreed early on was pretty important. Because if not, then any fantasy is as good as any other. But it isn't, you see. And using your imagination doesn't mean just going anywhere you like. When mathematicians and scientists made their big discoveries using imagination, their imagination led them to a place that was real. And I think our imaginations are capable of leading us to real places if we are attentive to them and don't simply allow fantasy to rule because that's what we wish.
I mean, another way of dealing with this be to split things into being and knowing, so that the left is dealing with epistemic things, but the right is having encounters. It deals with being. It's not an epistemic stance at all when you're encountering and imagining.
I see where you're going, and I think there's something in that, but I wouldn't wish all ways of knowing the world to be centred in the left hemisphere. I mean, even at the level of knowing alone, which is not the end of the story, there's understanding and intelligence and so forth, but even at the level of knowing, there are two kinds of knowing. There's, knowing the facts and knowing from experience. Mm-hmm. And the right hemisphere is much better at knowing from experience. If I say I know that Paris is the capital of France, the left hemisphere has clocked that and AI can take that on board. But if I say I know Paris because I lived there for 3 years, that is, I'm talking about right hemisphere-based autobiographical experience, which, AI and so on can't do and the left hemisphere can't do. So even at the level of knowing, in that very simple way, they're both contributing. But certainly when it comes to wisdom, I think it is very strongly based in the right hemisphere, the letting go of either it's this or it's that, the letting go of the idea that you can make sequential steps in a path to truth, the letting go of the idea that non-doing, non-action, non-knowing may be wiser than the opposite of them, etc.
Mm-hmm. And so how does this fit with the notion of partial views as well? Because this is the idea of a partial view is something also that might suggest something a bit ROT-ish, real thing out there. So it almost suggests that there's something like the elephant and the blind men. There's a thing out there and we're taking different perspectives on it. But again, really, on your view, there's no elephant without the blind men and there's no blind men without the elephant or something like that. So they're not taking partial views. They are it's almost a constructive process more than anything.
I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. I think, but also I think that, so, for example, any one performance of a piece of music is not the definitive performance of it. There are better and worse performances. So much as one may dislike the idea of things being asymmetrical and closer or further from truth, the fact is that some performances are simply better than others in the eyes of people who really know anything about the music. And I think our performances are like that. So our takes on the world may be better takes than other takes. But they can never... The mistake is to think that there is a something that would be there if nobody knew it. And there is a something, but this is where language becomes tricky, and it might be better to adhere to your idea of calling it a nothing, but a nothing that is full of potential. So I'm going to be having a talk shortly with Donald Hoffman, and I agree with some of his ideas, but he has this view that, in a way, all that we can ever know is what can be read off from dials inside the head. I see exactly what he's saying, that we don't have full capacity for full knowledge of anything, really. We can only see it in the way that our brains do relay it. But I think what they do is, the brain is not just... It's not producing a complete image, but the completeness, the partial nature of the knowledge can have two meanings. It could be, as it were, that we get part of the way to knowing it and then we have to stop. Or it could mean that we go all the way to knowing part of it, but we don't know the other parts of it. And I incline towards the second of these. I think that when we know things, rather as Whitehead's, I think, believed, that we are genuinely in touch with something and we are experiencing something real. It's not just made up inside our heads. But I don't think it can, of course, be equated with full knowledge, because on another occasion, from another standpoint, another aspect of all this will come forth.
Yeah, I must say the way I've started viewing this relationship is that, so the world has its freedom and it's in a state of nothingness relative to us, but we are in a state of full freedom relative to it. So it doesn't know what question we're going to ask it, but we don't know what option it's going to give us out. So we're both almost like in a similar condition with respect to each other. And it's not until the thing happens that being is laid down, to use Merleau-Ponty's word, and we lay it down in these acts.
Yes.
And what's interesting...
Which is another way of saying that it's always becoming, and that we contribute to that process of becoming. Yeah. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, no. On the Hoffman thing, the idea that it's all just in the brain, and I mean, you can ask the same thing about the hemispheres. You put a lot of focus on intuition, but there are certain intuitions, especially mathematical intuitions, that seem to go beyond the brain. And, Plato would have said that there's a whole realm of forms. And you might think that the forms are actually quite left hemisphere. And we can make, in Goldbach's conjecture, every even number greater than 2 is the sum of 2 primes. We just know it. It's infinite, but we just know it. It's not appearing on dials in the brain because it can't fit in there. So you get people like Frege who introduce a third thing, right, in order to have somewhere for these things to fit. What do you make of this degree of intuition where you are making infinite leaps? How do they happen, on your view?
It's a very good question, and I'm not sure I have a ready answer to it. I think that mathematics is such a fascinating and curious case. Curious in the sense that it's not really like any other kind of knowledge we have. And I certainly wouldn't accept the idea that we, as it were, simply made it up. I think it's there for our encounter. It's there for us to cognize. And I suppose that intuitions are... I mean, to be honest, we don't really know where intuitions come from. Some of them are innate. In other words, they don't have to be learnt or products of experience. They just are intuitive from the very word go. So even babies and infants and so on have certain preferences and instinctual understanding, if you like to put it that way, that doesn't have to be engineered. And then there are intuitions that come from, God knows what. I mean, a good example is I talk about Franck Mourier, a man who made his living out of being a tipster. And he'd go to these races and he'd watch the jockeys with their horses for 5 minutes, wandering about in a paddock or riding them for a few strides. And then he had to decide which one was going to win the race. And because he was a very rational man, he had an instinct of what was going to happen. And he said, but sometimes it's only by a tenth of a second. How can I know that? And he became so tormented by this that he gave up being a tipster because he couldn't bear it. And to begin with, he would his job was to communicate quickly to a bookmaker who would set the odds for any one particular horse. And he would say, horse A. And then he'd go, but why do I say that? No, it's got to be horse B. And he was always right with his first choice and wrong with his second choice. And eventually the bookmaker said, look, for God's sake, just send us your first impression and don't go back on it. And the gist of this is that he has no explanation of where that comes from. But he was able to make a judgment which brought in a 6-figure salary. So he was doing something right. And it tormented him that he had no idea. And then he read my work and he felt, and that's why he got in touch with me. I wouldn't have known him. In fact, his wife got in touch with me first to say, this is tormenting my husband, that he's found an answer in reading The Master and His Emissary. So I think the point with intuition is that we can make up stories about where they come from, and sometimes we're right. But some of these intuitions are very hard to predict. And intuitions are not infallible. I mean, come on. But then, very, very importantly, chains of reasoning are not infallible either. So, the example I like to give is that of Kepler, I think, who one day lecturing in Graz had the overwhelming certainty that the first 5 planets' orbits imaged the Platonic solids. And he just knew it, but he was completely wrong. So that can happen. And that's perhaps overemphasized in our world because intuitions are hugely valuable in getting us to abandon completely false positions.
Yeah.
But, reasoning also leads to false positions. It is what... Chesterton said many wise things, but one of them was, the madman is not somebody who has lost his reason, it's somebody who's lost everything but his reason. And therefore concludes from the fact that there are voices in the room, but no people, that they must be coming through the electric sockets, because those are the only points of ingress into the room. It's perfectly rational, but it has no understanding of how the world works.
Yeah.
And intuitions depend on experience to a large extent, although, as I say, some of them are innate.
Yeah. I mean, a mathematician would say that it's still experience. They would probably give a right-hand type of account and say they are in that space encountering the mathematical object directly, which is how they express it themselves. I mean,
who's to say they're wrong?
Well, exactly. Your tipster guy sounds a bit like, it's almost like a savant syndrome.
Yes.
In that case.
Yes.
Where there's some strange skill and you can't quite pin it down in the brain in any reasonable way. I mean, some of these are staggering. They don't make any sense at all. Sort of people who can suddenly play any piece of music whatsoever and just recreate it. It doesn't make sense as something that's located in the brain almost. And I suppose it must be. I mean, you know these better than me. On the Kepler.
Sorry, go on. Yes. I was only going to say yes. I mean, some of these savants are basically illiterate and can hardly do simple maths, but they can do things in their head that, defy explanation. But anyway, carry on. Yes.
Well, I was just going to make the point about the Kepler. Hermann Weyl has a nice quote about killing an ugly fact, with an ugly fact killing a beautiful theory, which happened to one of his theories as well. He was convinced that it must be true, even though every experiment said it wasn't true, one of his theories. Just wouldn't have it.
Okay. But looking on the positive side, many of their discoveries were made because the answer was so beautiful that it had to be true. I mean, many people have said that. And then only later were they able to explain why, in fact, it was right. Anyway, yeah.
Okay. I think this might be a good place to stop. I've had a good conversation there, and yeah, I mean, that was lovely. Do you have any final closing remark you'd like to make, or anything that we should have discussed that didn't get discussed?
No, not really. I mean, I think some of the parallels in physics with the hemisphere theory are striking. And of all scientists who communicated with me after the writing of these books, the greatest number were physicists. That wasn't what I anticipated, and they wrote in a very positive frame that what you are discussing here makes sense of things that we are confronting in physics. And of course, I'm not a properly trained physicist, so all I can do is read things and think that resonates, and then hope that I'm not completely, sadly, putting my foot in it. But it's very nice that there are physicists who will definitely tell me whether what I'm saying is completely ridiculous or on a track that they would support. So, I mean, perhaps the one thing we didn't do was explore some of those, but I didn't think we would get right. I didn't know what we would do, actually. And I've been very delighted with what we have done. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe we'll talk about Lee Smolin's work next time. He probably was one of the people that contacted you. His is basically a direct mapping onto your hemisphere hypothesis. His particular
pretty much so.
Yeah,
I was staggered when I read that. Yes.
Yeah,
but there are a lot of physicists that do map very easily onto it. But anyway, look, thank you very, very much, and I'll let you get to bed.
Yes, it's gone midnight. Midnight with McGilchrist, an old radio program.
Very good.
Thanks very much. Have a good day.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.